Hello, I'm Professor Tony Ward. I'm the developer of the Good Lives model of offender rehabilitation, and I'm just going to say a few brief words about this approach. I guess the thing you need to understand is that the Good Lives model developed out of the risk-need-responsivity model. Early in 2001, I started looking very systematically at the risk-need-responsivity model and discovered that while it contained a number of very useful principles, the principles of risk, need and responsivity, it was fairly negatively keyed, and it was difficult to motivate individuals using an approach that was essentially concerned with community protection and risk management. So what I tried to do then is to develop a more comprehensive framework that was strength-based and much more constructive. And what I mean by that is that it's responsive to offenders' particular interests, abilities and aspirations, and also encourages clinicians to explicitly construct intervention plans, or what I call Good Lives plans, that help offenders develop the capabilities they need to achieve the things that matter to them. So it's about capability building, resource giving, as well as taking into account an individual's particular interests. And very importantly, as you will notice as you look at the major classes of primary goods, that what I say is that the primary goods an offender weights most highly are those likely to be connected with their sense of meaning in life, or what I have termed practical identities. So for example, a mother who may value the good of caregiving and relatedness extremely highly, and the tasks involved in being a caregiver and the way she goes about doing that give her a sense of identity. It's a practical identity because it's about a way of being in the world, a way of living that structures her everyday activities and sets her priorities. Now, of course, other things are important to such an individual. For example, creativity, having kind of leisure activities, knowledge generation, and so on. But they're all kind of play more of I guess, a secondary role, or perhaps more accurately, they don't have the importance that relatedness does and caregiving for such an individual. So what this means from a rehabilitation point of view, it's important for clinicians to understand very clearly exactly what matters most to an offender. And we do this through looking at their offending, what was going on at that time in their lives, and often the themes that come through in their offending speak quite directly to their core commitments or values, that is, their primary human goods. For some individuals, sex offenders for example, it's possible to understand their sexually abusive actions towards children as searches for intimacy. For others, it's about control and domination related to agency or autonomy. For others, it's simply about the intense pleasure. Whatever the primary goods that underlie the offending behaviour, it's pretty clear that while the goods may be okay, the values in themselves in the abstract are perfectly acceptable. What I call the secondary goods, or the instrumental means by which people go about achieving these goods, that's where the problem is. And from a Good Lives perspective, criminogenic needs are actually refer to the problems in these secondary goods or means. So individuals typically, when you look at the way they live their lives, they lack sufficient capacity or ability to achieve the primary goods in ways that are socially acceptable and also personally meaningful. Secondly, you look carefully at their implicit Good Lives plans. There's often conflicts with the way they go about trying to seek primary goods. For example, somebody might value the primary good of knowledge highly as well as relatedness, but spend all their time at work and ignore their relationships, so there is a conflict between those two sets of primary goods. A third problem refers to the scope, and what that means is that there are important goods not being addressed. For example, in the work example, the person may put no energy into relatedness at all, not to mention the goods relating to their health, leisure and so on. And when there's a lack of scope, there's a huge imbalance in somebody's lives. And there's likely to be all sorts of secondary problems related to that. And a final problem refers to the capacity. The individual lacks the internal resources and skills, understanding, cognitive capacity, whatever, to achieve the primary goods in ways that are socially acceptable and personally fulfilling. And they also lack the external capacities or the social resources. And in a nutshell, that's kind of a very good and fairly concise overview of what the GLM is about in terms of the way we understand someone's offending. When it comes to practice, what we do is take these ideas and put them into action. And this means the clinician needs to systematically explore the goods that were associated with someone's offending, but look at the other classes of primary goods at the time of their offending and ask the question, were these goods present to some degree or were they conspicuously absent? And in a more kind of holistic way, looking at their implicit life plans, that is their rough idea of what their life should look like and how they link their day-to-day activities together, and look for those 4 flaws I mentioned earlier. Flaws to do with capacity, flaws to do with scope, flaws to do with conflict, and flaws to do with means. And put that to work. So of a particular offender, for example, an individual might have had real problems with knowledge and might have put their good intellect into play, seeking offending. They might have been, for one man I worked with, was an intelligence officer in the gang. He used his very good mind to plan and to offences and robberies, and we needed to figure out another way you could take that strength of his and put it into good use. But to give you a concrete example of how this can work, there's an individual I'm aware of in New Zealand. I spent some time talking to his clinician and seeing this guy, and he was a Maori offender. He was a New Zealand indigenous individual, and what this guy was looking for was an opportunity to, while he was in prison, opportunity to learn to be a carver. There's a whole tradition of indigenous Maori carving that is spiritually fulfilling and also gives somebody a kind of a specific and meaningful role within the Maori community, and also can earn some money as well. So what we did was take this core primary good of creativity and thought about how this guy could achieve this. And one of the ways he could achieve this was through Maori carving. In order to be trusted with very precise tools, very sharp instruments, he needed to learn to manage his anger more effectively. He needed to develop much better concentration skills, planning skills, and gradually was allowed more and more freedom within the workshop and was introduced to more and more complex techniques that required much finer motor and emotional control. Now this meant he also worked on his criminogenic needs around alcohol, anger management, impulsivity, social alienation and aggression. These are all areas that were targeted as well. So over time what happened, the individual developed the skills to be a carver. He had a great incentive to work on these other areas because he wanted access to the workshop. But very importantly, the very act of learning the carving skills was causally related to a reduction of certain criminogenic needs. So for example, developing the concentration and the planning required to be a good carver meant he had to handle his responsivity, etc. issues very well. So what we have here is a good example of the Good Lives model in action. One thing I'll say in passing is that the Good Lives model is a comprehensive, systematic model, and it's designed to unify all aspects of a person's intervention plan. So therapists might work on the psychological issues, teachers and vocational trainers will work on the education and employment related issues, and so on. So it's a very ecologically valid approach, comprehensive, and critically it incorporates risk management within a strength-based framework. So in a nutshell, that's the Good Lives model. Thank you very much.